Hello, hello everyone, and thank you for being here for this side event, Global Shipping Tax, Transport Decarbonization and Climate Finance for Vulnerable Countries. This is a side event co-organized by Ferdi, which is the Foundation for Studies and Research on International Development, a French think tank whose mission is to promote innovative development policies based on the latest results from economic research, and Transport and Environment, a green campaign group whose vision is to deliver a zero-emission transport and energy system that is affordable, circular, and has minimal impacts on our health and the environment. I'm Vianney Doquiet. I'm the Ferdi Scientific Director, and I have the pleasure to moderate this side event. In which we will discuss the double objectives of a global shipping tax, transport decarbonization on one hand, and contribution to climate finance on the other hand. It will start with opening remarks by Lord Livermore, Financial Secretary to the UK Treasury, followed by 3 interventions, 1 on-site by myself and 2 online by Jacob Armstrong from Transport and Environment, and Polona Gregorian from the European Commission, that will set the scene, present global as well as regional initiatives for shipping taxation, notably in the European Union. We will then move to a panel with 4 highly qualified speakers, Christelle Pratt, Assistant Secretary General of the Organization of African, Caribbean, and Pacific States, Roel Anders, Head of Climate Action and Clean Air at the International Maritime Organization, and Araceli Fernandez-Pales, Head of the Technology Innovation Unit at the International Energy Agency, and Tom Evans, a Senior Associate to the Global Solidarity Levies Task Force at the European Climate Foundation. So I don't say more words for the introduction, and I leave the floor to Lord Livermore. Thank you for opening this side event with opening remarks.
Thank you very much for your introduction. And firstly, I would also like to thank colleagues at T&E and Ferdi for inviting me to take part in this important discussion today. I'm delighted to be speaking alongside a panel of colleagues from a range of sectors, including many subject matter experts. Let me start by saying that I recognize, of course, the scale of the climate crisis is enormous. We need to cut global emissions much faster and more significantly than we have done to date. So I'm delighted that the Prime Minister announced the UK's ambitious new 2035 NDC at the World Leaders Climate Action Summit 2 days ago, with a headline target of 81%. That said, we need collective action and ambition if we are going to meet the Paris Agreement's goal of limiting global warming to 1.5 degrees. We must also mobilize much more finance for the global transition and ensure it is both high quality and accessible. We recognize that finance is not flowing at the scale required to meet the long-term goals of the Paris Agreement. We also cannot ignore the uncertain and challenging political, macroeconomic, and fiscal context that we are all operating in, especially those of us working in a finance ministry like HM Treasury. As part of the effort to cut global emissions, it's crucial that we work to decarbonize the shipping sector. For the UK, our emissions trading scheme is our primary decarbonisation scheme for industry. And in 2026, the emissions trading scheme will expand to encompass emissions from the domestic maritime sector. Domestic measures like this are the first port of call in cutting emissions. However, while we can and should take ambitious and bold steps at home to both curb emissions and invest sustainably, there is a strong case that for shipping, we also need further international measures. In general, it wouldn't be right for international levies to supersede and replace domestic tax systems. So why an international measure for shipping in particular? Firstly, ships carrying goods and people are intrinsic to the operation of our global economy, and their emissions are hard to abate. Secondly, the nature of shipping means there is a risk from relying solely on domestic measures that we see undue competitive distortions or large gaps for avoidance and leakage. A global measure would capture global emissions that are not currently in scope of domestic regimes. Those are the circumstances where there are hard-to-tackle emissions, where even coordinated domestic regimes cannot meet the need, and where an international pricing measure can help without crowding out those domestic regimes, where an international measure can add real value. For that reason, at the UN General Assembly in September, the Prime Minister announced the UK's support for a global decarbonisation shipping measure currently being worked up at the International Maritime Organization. A measure that puts a price on shipping emissions would provide important funding to help decarbonise the maritime sector. And the UK also supports proceeds going to tackle climate change more broadly. It's also important to draw a link between this discussion and the top issue for many of us here in Baku, the new collective quantified goal. We cannot see the subject of innovative finance in isolation from the broader conversation. While in Baku, I'm delighted to have been able to hear the perspectives from colleagues around the world on how we should design the NCQG. Agreeing a goal that is ambitious, feasible and deliverable is the UK's top priority. We are also clear that the NCQG should be focused on the needs and priorities of developing countries and speaks to the finance that needs to flow in the trillions from all sources, including a stretching public finance target in the billions, and which should also include a small number of new contributors. We see a global price on shipping emissions as an innovative measure that could help deliver the kind of finance we need to support the global transition. Creating new burdens on business is, of course, not something that we should take lightly, especially for a sector like shipping, which underpins so much of the world's trade in goods. But if we can get the design right, we have an opportunity to incentivize the same sort of green transition in shipping that we are seeing for electric vehicles on our roads, and to help mobilize much needed finance for the broader global transition. And the UK will play its own part in that. Indeed, the Prime Minister made clear at UNGA that the UK will continue to be a leading contributor to international climate finance. But we know that public sources of finance alone are not enough. Given all of this, I very much look forward to hearing the perspectives from many here today on both how we can decarbonise the shipping sector and how we might do that in a way that can help finance broader climate change efforts. Thank you very much.
Thank you a lot, Lord Livermore, for these elements on how the UK envisioned this global shipping tax and what has been done in that direction so far. So I want to say a few words before we move to the online presentation and next the panel. Maybe to give a little bit additional elements to set the scene of this global shipping tax. And just first to say that emissions for global shipping are approximately 3% of global CO2 emissions. And taxing global shipping is a way to implement a minimum carbon price, which is a sound economic policy for climate. And it's important to have this minimum carbon price on every sector to avoid any leakage. And at the same time, international taxation, such as global shipping taxation, is also part of the toolbox of innovative instruments to finance the transition of developing countries, especially vulnerable ones. And it's also innovative because in that case, the private sector is asked to contribute. And it is one way to apply the polluter pays principle. So there are many ongoing global discussions for this shipping tax, discussion at the International Maritime Organization. And it's also part of the mandate of the Global Solidarity Levies Task Force. And in our panel, we will have a more deep discussion of how these negotiations are going by Roll Anders and Tom Evans. A shipping tax can be global, but it could also be implemented regionally, for instance, at the level of the European Union. And this can be effective if a significant proportion of international trade is concerned. And it may be easier to implement compared to a global one, since a consensus would be simpler to attain. But at the same time, if it's implemented regionally, then leakages and substitutions would be complex to monitor. A shipping tax would impact international trade, of course, because it would increase transport costs for seaborne trade. And seaborne trade represents more than 10 billion tons of merchandise. So it is reasonable to anticipate that such a tax would reduce volumes first, but also average distance traveled by goods. So in a sense, it would encourage trade with closer neighbors. Reducing volumes and reducing distance are two immediate levers for reducing emissions. Longer-term levers include technological progress towards clean energy in the maritime sector, and we will have again a more deep discussion of this by Ms. Fernandez-Pales from the International Energy Agency in the panel. So by modifying permanently relative prices, a carbon tax on shipping fuel could activate both short-term and longer-term levers for decarbonization. At the same time, there would be proceeds from the tax, and they can be substantial. Ferdi conducted a quantitative study to estimate both the proceeds and the effects of potential global carbon tax on trade. And we estimate that a $40 tax per ton of CO2 implemented worldwide could result in proceeds around $40 billion each year. So this amount could be mobilized as international climate finance. So is global shipping taxation a silver bullet? Well, a closer look at the effects of such a tax and at the countries which would be impacted the most reveals a nuanced picture. Intuitively, countries that are geographically remote from world markets and that mostly trade goods with a low value to volume ratio should be impacted the most. Consumers in these countries are likely to witness the highest purchasing power loss, since highest trade costs would pass through consumer prices. And indeed, our quantitative study highlights that the least developed countries and small island developing states would be disproportionately impacted by the tax, incurring a higher relative purchasing power loss than, let us say, OECD countries. So the fairness of a global shipping tax can be questioned, despite its alignment with the polluter pays principle. So tax proceeds could be mobilized for compensating the most impacted countries. Or alternatively, proceeds can be mobilized for helping maritime sector decarbonization and financing technological progress and clean infrastructure, which may be necessary if one wants to achieve the ambitious decarbonization objectives set by the International Maritime Organization for 2030 and 2050. So to come back on substitutions and potential leakages, an additional point here is that the decarbonization of the maritime sector should not lead to more carbon emissions by other transport modes. This is an issue since maritime transport is already a low carbon intensity transport mode. And if taxing shipping leads to a redirection of trade flows towards non-carbon taxed airborne trade, for instance, this could backfire. So to summarize, let me stress three questions and trade-offs that must be considered in the optimal design of a shipping carbon tax. The first one is about coverage. Is it a global or a regional carbon tax? Is it sectoral or part of a universal carbon price? Of course, a wider coverage implies more complex negotiations. Do we want short-term or long-term effects? So is the tax an instrument to incentivize changes of behaviors in the short term, or is it an instrument to encourage innovation and clean technological progress? And should the tax be complemented by other measures to reduce carbon footprint if we look at the longer term? And finally, about allocating the proceeds, it seems necessary to compensate the most vulnerable countries because they would be also the most impacted by the tax. So what can be done and how the proceeds can be allocated is an important topic also. Thank you for this. I wanted to add this introductory, to these introductory elements to set the scene. And so now we will have two online presentations. The first one by Jacob Armstrong. She's a shipping policy manager at Transport and Environment, and also the co-organizer of this side event. Jacob, do you hear us, and can I leave you the floor?
Yes, I can hear you. Can you hear me? Can you hear me?
Sorry.
Okay. Can you hear me now?
Perfect, Jacob. So the floor is yours.
Perfect. Great. All right. Thanks very much. Thank you, Vianney, and to Ferdi for co-organizing this event. Hello to everyone in the room and online. It's my pleasure to speak from Transport and Environment. I believe we have some slides which I can just about see over there. So today I'm just going to kind of say hello and present a couple of slides looking at the regional and NGO angle of this debate. Okay, so I'm going to present a little bit of novel research from T&E, analysing the impact and opportunities of looking at regional emissions pricing to shipping. So if we turn to the next slide. So the first point is why talk about regional? Why have the regional aspect in this debate? And I think the first thing to say is because regional shipping policy is taking place. As you can hopefully see in the map, the EU has moved forward with decarbonisation measures that we'll hear with a bit, and then China, UK, as we've heard, Turkey, are all in different stages of integrating shipping into their carbon markets too. National Norwegian pollution emissions pricing should be mentioned here as well as a very good case of national legislation. And these measures are all really, really relevant in the COP context because national action is the foundational element of the Paris Agreement. So that agreement states that advanced economies should act first and go faster with climate measures. This is because they can absorb higher costs while at the same time incentivizing emissions reduction and the development of green technology for all. So if we go to the next slide, then we see, what is the impact of regional measures? If you just turn to the next, that's the one, exactly. So here we can see a couple of years ago, T&E allocated shipping emissions to countries throughout the world. We did it by giving domestic voyages to the country and then half of international voyages. This is so no emissions go unregulated and that each country is allocated emissions on the same basis. And at first look, while individual countries have a lot of emissions, you can see China and the European Economic Area have close to 100 million tons of CO2 from shipping. No one country seems to have enough share of emissions to impact the global total. This might suggest that regional national action could be limited, but it doesn't give the full picture. So if we go to the next slide, we will see that while we talk a lot about the global nature of shipping, its concentration in just a few hotspots of global trade isn't mentioned enough. So China, the US, and Europe, including the UK, this one, dominate the global shipping trade so much that decarbonization measures in those places will affect 84% of the global fleet by ship number. And if you just take the EU and China, them regulating would regulate 4/5 of all of the world's ships. And that is only on a yearly basis. In a separate analysis, T&E found that in 2023, 6 out of 10 of the global fleet still in operation in 2023 had called in European ports over the past 5 years. We learned this by looking at all of the ships that had submitted emissions reports to the EU's monitoring system and compared that with the ships still in operation. So extrapolating that data in the future, we can say that in 5 years' time, the EU will have put a carbon price on more than half of the global fleet. So here we see global reach of regulation really is clear. So if we go to the next slide, we'll see that. So one of the criticisms of regional action is its impact on low-income nations. So just this morning, we put out novel research looking at the impact of the EU ETS on small island developing states and least developed economies, LDCs and SIDS. We find that the impact of the ETC will be quite minor throughout those countries. On average, only around 7% of seaborne trade from those countries will be covered by the EU ETS, and the biggest impacts will be on countries on the main trade routes to Europe, like West Africa, while countries in Asia Pacific have negligible impacts on their trade. In the next slide, we also looked at, in the context of this COP, the potential for carbon markets to act for climate finance. So what we did was we compared the amount that the EU could raise by extending its ETS to all the emissions that the EU currently monitors already, but doesn't price. And we found this is about 4 billion euros a year, which, just for comparison's sake, is equivalent to about 20% of what the EU should be paying in terms of the $100 billion climate finance goal. The biggest part of this comes from extending to all voyages to and from European ports. And these findings are relevant in the context of national shipping taxes for climate finance revenue generation. As we'll hear about later, the Global Solidarity Levies Task Force is about national templates. And so this really shows that until we have an ambitious global levy, national and regional taxes on shipping should be considered as novel and low impact sources of climate finance. So in the next slide, I'll look at the final piece of our analysis, which is where we looked at whether neighbouring countries to the EU could make use of the EU ETS. This would be through a programme which we call the ETS as a service, where port calls in these neighbouring countries would not be counted in the EU system, thereby extending the ETS to shipping voyages past these countries, as you see in the map, with revenues then redirected back to these countries and climate action expanded. In the next slide, you'll see that we analysed 4 countries, Turkey and the UK, both of whom, as we said, are in different stages of integrating their shipping sectors into their carbon markets, and Morocco and Egypt, some of whose ports are currently have this treatment under the EU ETS. And we find that through such a system, Morocco and the UK could cover a majority of their emissions and shipping voyages in such a system, while Egypt and Turkey could still also cover a significant proportion. So for the final, if we go to the final slide now, just a couple of conclusions here. Basically, from our perspective, what we see is that regional shipping action really can have global results. Regional or national pricing schemes should be important contributors to global climate finance and can be done so without significant impacts on low-income countries. And finally, working with neighbouring countries, regional regulations like the EU ETS could have even greater benefits, where things like the EU takes on the bureaucratic burden, but the benefits are shared by all. So just on the next slide, it leaves me to say thank you. Really looking forward to the panel, and looking forward. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Jacob, for this insightful discussion of how regional policies can have some global impacts on decarbonization and on climate finance also. So we are going to move to to next speaker, Ms. Paloma Gregorin, who is head of Unit for Mobility, Air, Rail, Water, and Intermodal Policy at the European Commission, Directorate General for Climate Action. Ms. Gregorin, can you hear us?
Yes, I can hear you well. Can you hear me?
Yes, perfect. So I leave you the floor.
Thank you very much. And first of all, I would like to thank Ferdi and Transport and Environment for organizing this meeting on two very important topics. On one hand, decarbonization of the maritime sector, and on the other hand, climate finance. So let me start by saying a few words on EU climate action on the maritime sector. Jacob already touched a bit on some of our measures, but maybe just to set the scene by saying that in the recent political guidelines for the new European Commission, because as you might know, we're having a bit of a change of mandate and power right now, we remain very committed to staying the course on the European Green Deal and the EU's climate neutrality objective for 2050. Now, to get there, the EU adopted several measures to make the maritime sector more sustainable. And this includes the extension of the EU emission trading system, so the EU ETS, that we already have for other sectors to the maritime sector from the beginning of this year. Now, a carbon price on shipping greenhouse gas emissions is necessary to give the economic incentives to reduce emissions, including by bridging the price gap between conventional and sustainable fuels, which we hear all the time is very important to sort of incentivize the much needed uptake of these fuels as a short-term solution, but also energy efficiency and other sort of operational measures that can be taken to reduce emissions. So the EU system covers 100% of emissions from voyages between EU ports and within EU ports, and it covers 50% of emissions from voyages that start or end in the EU, but extend beyond the EU. And in this respect, the analysis that Jacob just presented is very, very valuable input. But importantly, by covering 50% of, let's say, our emissions, the EU ETS covers only the fair share of EU's maritime emissions from international voyages. And why do we do this? This is important to allow third countries to decide on what they deem as appropriate action for the remaining share of emissions, and also any potential revenue stemming from these actions if this was carbon pricing measure. Of course, promoting carbon pricing in our trading partners, including neighboring countries, is certainly part, I would say, a big part of our policies. So I'm also very glad to see that we have several countries represented here today in the panel, and I'm sure also in the audience today, because the broader implementation of carbon pricing we have, of course, the stronger the transformational effect. So let me continue a bit on some other benefits of carbon pricing. And that, of course, is also one that was already mentioned, that it also raises substantial revenue. As the EU example shows, or taking the EU example, we see that some of the ETS revenue is allocated to an innovation fund. And we have a bold commitment from our side, from the European Commission, to dedicate part of that revenue to accelerate the decarbonization of the maritime sector specifically. Now, the other bigger part of the revenue is being fully used on a range of climate-related purposes. And this also includes climate finance for vulnerable third countries. And I'll say a bit more on the ETS revenue a bit later. In addition to the EU ETS, we also have other measures which will also create the conditions for the development at scale of sustainable alternative fuels, for the use of onshore power supply, and for the uptake of innovative technologies, all sort of a policy mix that will together deliver or help decarbonize the maritime sector. And finally, the upcoming European Maritime Industrial Strategy will also constitute an important element in this respect, and also an important element of the new European Clean Industrial Deal. Now, I said a few words on the EU, let's say, regional action, but of course, at the same time, the EU is fully engaged at the global level. to push for the right regulatory framework that will allow the sector to reach the level of ambition agreed in the revised IMO greenhouse gas strategy last year. And this includes a pricing measure. Again, we think that a global pricing mechanism that is complementary to a global fuel standard, so a regulatory measure, will facilitate the transition. It will make it overall cheaper if we have the carbon pricing in the mix, both for the industry and for the states. And again, it will help bridge this very important price gap between fossil and sustainable fuels. And importantly, as the previous speaker have already mentioned, the revenues from the pricing mechanism can be used on one hand to decarbonize the sector itself, but they can also be used to address any disproportionate impacts of the measures on states, in particular the poorest, and those that are most dependent on maritime sector, such as SIDS and LDCs. Now, finally, let me also conclude by saying a few words on climate finance and EU action there. So I don't think I need to remind everyone that last year, the United Arab Emirates consensus said it loud and clear: aligning finance flows with the pathway for mitigation and resilience set by the Paris Agreement is absolutely essential. And of course, new collective quantified goals should retain international finance mobilized at its core. And the EU continues to play its part. So in 2023 alone, we provided 28.7 billion euro, or almost $31 billion in public finance, with an additional 7.2 billion euro of private finance mobilized. And carbon pricing remains, in our view and experience, the most effective instrument, in line with the call for action to Paris-aligned carbon markets. I've already mentioned the recent EU ETS extension to maritime, but next year will also mark 2 decades since our EU emission trading system has already been operating for other sectors. And that turned basically carbon pricing in a virtuous gold mine, in the sense that already 200 billion euro have been raised by the EU ETS since 2005, of which almost 44 billion euro in last year alone. So, and that was all revenue raised at the same time while the emissions in the sectors covered plummeted by 47%. So we can have both. We can have decarbonization and we can have revenue raised at the same time. So the time has now also come to support efforts towards new and innovative levies to support climate finance. And this is why we've decided to join the Global Solidarity Levies Task Force that we'll also hear further about today. So I'm very glad to see this event today, and I'm also to see the representatives of the task force later in the panel. Because the bigger, of course, the scale and scope of contributors, the faster the change in mindset and the larger the pool of support that we can provide for climate finance. So thank you very much for your attention, and looking forward to the debate later on.
Thank you a lot, Ms. Gregory. So we can move now to the second part of this event with a panel. So I'm calling the panelists to come to the floor. So Christelle Pratt, Assistant Secretary General of the Organization of African, Caribbean, and Pacific States. Hello. Roel Anders, Head of Climate Action and Clean Air at International Maritime Organization. Araceli Fernandez-Pales, Head of the Technology Innovation Unit at International Energy Agency. And Tom Evans, Senior Associate, Global Solidarity's Levies Task Force at the European Climate Foundation. Sorry, can you put the slides, the first ones on the screen? Yeah, okay, thank you. So, thank you all. And I'm just first going to ask the panelists if we can change a little bit the order of speaking, because I understood that Ms. Fernandez-Pales has a commitment after this session. So If it's okay for you, may we switch the intervention of Ms. Pratt and Ms. Fernandez-Pales? I'm sorry for this last-minute changes, but I think it's the way we can leave enough time to Ms. Fernandez-Pales. So, Ms. Fernandez-Pales, I leave you the floor for this this panel, and maybe just to ask you how the International Energy Agency is seeing both the shipping sector and the decarbonization of the shipping sector in relation with the really ambitious objectives that this sector has set for decarbonization.
Thank you very much, and good afternoon, everyone. Please just let me first of all thank Ferdi and T&E for the great organization of this event, which is a very important topic indeed, and not discussed enough, I guess. But really, just a couple of points from my side as a first approximation to the topic, and bring in a little bit some of the thinking from the International Energy Agency on this area. I think, first of all, just to acknowledge indeed the importance of the shipping sector for the global economy. Again, something that is never said enough when we think about that 80% of trade by mass is really related to the shipping sector and is shipped around the world. At the same time, this is for good reasons. I mean, this is because, as has been mentioned as well in the first remarks, shipping is the less energy intensive way of transporting goods. And so that's something that, we have to really value, as well as, the progress that has been made so far when it comes to reducing emissions in the sector. When we track back, the evolution of shipping activity, for example, since 2008, what we see is a 50% increase in the activity of the shipping sector, but only a 10% increase in the CO2 emissions of the sector, even if it still is fully or almost fully reliable on fossil fuels. This really gives us a sign of, how seriously as well operators are looking into, making sure that all the improvements that possible on the energy efficiency of the actual vessel, of the operations of the vessel, can be really put forward. So that's an encouraging trend already that I think it's important to highlight. From the International Energy Agency, we've been doing work on understanding what will be the implications in terms of challenges, but also opportunities to decarbonize the shipping sector, particularly on its international operations. And we do this by looking at the numbers and with our analytical and modeling tools, trying to understand what would be the different levers, and again, what would be the implications of developing those different levers. First of all, we start by understanding what is the outlook for the activity of the shipping sector moving forward. And of course, that's not only from the basis of understanding how the macroeconomic picture could evolve, but also echoing the point that it was made before about, potential sectorial leakage of emissions. We really think that all sectors need to contribute to the effort of the decarbonization, of reaching net zero emissions by 2050. And as a result, what we see is that for us, it's very important to understand the implications of decarbonizing certain areas of the energy system, how this could imply, or what would be the implications again for the shipping sector when it comes to the activity of the sector, how goods are going to be traded moving forward, would these goods be different, and would these shipping routes be different, and also to understand the implications of the needs of the different alternative fuels that the decarbonization of the shipping sector would require, what implications this could have on the energy supply as well, in terms of infrastructure, not only on the production side, but as well, again, on bunkering infrastructure, on the distribution infrastructure for those type of fuels. So we start by looking at all of these aspects. And we've done recently, we released our most recent technology flagship work and analysis 3 weeks ago, which is called Energy Technology Perspectives, where we actually devoted a particular deep dive on the decarbonization of the shipping sector, but more importantly as well, looking at the evolution of manufacturing and trade and how the shipping routes of a clean energy system could look like compared to the shipping routes of that we are seeing today, to really understand these possible changes. The second element is about, of course, once we've talked about, the activity and implications on that front, more about decarbonization levers per se. And here, of course, I've made a note already to improvements on energy efficiency. We really think that this is something that needs to continue progressing. So we really tapped as much as possible on existing technologies, existing measures, existing or best strategies from the operational side to make the most of this potential. But of course, when we talk about deep decarbonization, alternative fuels need to come into play. And this is where we look at a portfolio of measures from methanol to ammonia to different biofuels to electric ships as well for certain operations. So this is an area that it's important for us to understand, again, the implications of that. And I just wanted to mention as well, as the final point in my initial remarks, that we not only look at the decarbonization of shipping from the implications for changes or technology developments that may be required on the vessel itself, but also from a bunkering perspective, from a production perspective for the different fuels that could be required, what would be the implications? And here, just to mention that in this last analysis, but over the past years, we've been also looking at the opportunities for emerging markets and developing economies to also make the most of their abundant and excellent renewable resources, where we see very cost-attractive regions to produce those alternative fuels that could be required as well for the decarbonization of the shipping sector. And this can be also an opportunity, an economic opportunity to develop this type of industries, this type of activities, as well as develop further their shipping infrastructure when it comes to more the logistics side. So we also look at, again, the opportunities for those regions from the supply side of those fuels. And yeah, I may just stop here for now. Thank you.
Thank you a lot, Ms. Fernandez-Pales, for this overview of the work of the International Energy Agency in that direction. And let me maybe turn to Ms. Pratt, Assistant Secretary General of the Organization of African, Caribbean, and Pacific States, to ask her how this kind of global carbon tax is seen from the member states' perspective in your organization, and how do you see the different the different objectives that such a tax could have for the international community. Ms. Pratt.
Thank you very much to Ferdi and to T&E for inviting the participation of the Organization of African, Caribbean and Pacific States. Just for a bit of background on the OACPS, we're 79 vulnerable developing countries, so the largest intergovernmental organization for the Global South. And we represent 1.3 billion people. In fact, I'm sorry, Vianney, but I had prepared a response to a question on green hydrogen. And I just wondered, because those were the
no problem. That's an important point also.
Oh, yeah. No, I mean, and the reason for this is I really have to admit that there are some very distinguished panelists here who are steeped in global shipping and taxation and all of these manner of things. And I am almost somewhat of a fraud. Because I am not so experienced, but what I wanted to do was perhaps to bring OACPS perspectives on such matters, and then also looking at the issues around climate finance and the implications on many of our vulnerable developing countries. And so I did do a little bit of work with colleagues on green hydrogen, which was a question that had been asked of me. And I just wanted to respond by saying that, and this is an alternative fuel, of course, that it is our understanding that it is a zero emissions fuel, and that when produced through electrolysis, the only emission is water. And we understand that it is a practical and implementable solution that holds a great promise for decarbonising heavy industry and creating jobs globally, and that it holds huge promise in helping revolutionise the way we power our planet. So a bit of a segue from the previous speaker's comments on how we move forward. OACPS understands the potential for green hydrogen energy remains huge if untapped alongside the renewable energy sources such as wind and solar, and all of this readily available in our countries and needed to power a truly green transition that would leapfrog the fossil fuel energy systems for our member states. For OACPS countries, efforts to build a green hydrogen energy industry are at a very nascent stage, with Namibia advancing, and then feasibility studies, financing pipelines, and regulatory changes ongoing in a number of OACPS countries. But to actually realise the potential of a hydrogen-powered economy, OACPS countries must ensure that the industry is structured to achieve a just energy transition that serves the needs of local communities, not foreign interests. If done well, it would be a welcome relief and enable us to escape inefficient and damaging fossil fuel, the driver of geostrategic competition and wars. The critical issue would be to ensure that green hydrogen energy projects in our countries actually contribute to the local value addition and avoid the creation of another extractive industry. The new green energy investments, if well supported, can secure a transformation of the energy systems of our member states while avoiding the pitfalls of yesteryears where billions of dollars in investments in fossil fuel energy extraction have not yielded any dramatic increases in access to electricity for many of our rural people in our member states, nor have these investments resulted in improving our overall sustainable development goal metrics. But there are also risks that we would need to be mindful of in the design and delivery of large-scale green hydrogen projects, such as land use conflicts, forced resettlement, expropriation, and other potential human rights violations, as well as damaging the fragile ecosystems of our places. The development of green hydrogen in OACPS countries must, of essence, serve the interests of our member states and spur locally based value chains, improve access to green, clean electricity for all, and ensure ecological integrity. A strong enabling environment with robust legislation and financing at scale must be highlighted as the key drivers for growth of green hydrogen energy, and OACPS countries' access to highly concessional finance for such endeavours to mitigate the global impacts of climate change must be key considerations. Because as we know, many of our countries cannot afford to be duped into further indebtedness, so that the carbon footprints of others can be reduced at our expense. And so I'll stop there on green energy, and hopefully you'll come back with another question that is more related to the discussion here at hand in the side event. Thank you, Veronique.
Thank you a lot for putting also this discussion in the perspective of the more general renewable energy challenges for all countries, and it resonates with the preceding intervention, I think, of the International Energy Agency. So next speaker is Roel Anders, Head of Climate Action and Clean Air at IMO. the International Maritime Organization, where, as you may know, there are well advanced ongoing discussions on this global shipping tax. So, Mr. Anders, will just ask you maybe to explain how these international discussions are ongoing at IMO, and how, in your perspective, are the next steps? What are the next steps, and how we will end up in these discussions?
Thank you very much, Vianney, and a very good afternoon, everyone. And it's really a great pleasure to see you all here in person and joining these very important discussions about what the IMO is doing right now in terms of defining the regulatory framework for decarbonizing the shipping industry. I'd like to thank actually, or start with thanking Ferdi and T&E for organizing this very important panel here in Baku at COP29, and to bring the progress that the IMO is making in setting really the global scene in decarbonizing one of the hard abate sectors through global regulatory measures. It was great to hear actually from the previous speakers, including from the UK Financial Secretary, from Jacob himself, as well as from the European Commission, that everyone is very committed to the process within the IMO. And that process is very well on the way. And as was already explained by some of the previous speakers, so I don't want to dwell on that, IMO member states are committed to deliver next year, October, on a new regulatory framework that will set binding requirements for global shipping on a pathway to net zero to be achieved by around 2015. And it's great actually to see many familiar faces here today in the audience, and many of you we cross path and sit across the negotiation table in London. But I just want to say that it's very important actually that we are all here as a community, as a shipping community, at COP29, and I myself have been here since Sunday together with our Secretary General for a couple of days. And what is important is that we have brought to the attention of this COP community, from the many people here present in Baku, what the shipping industry is doing. But we've also made it very clear that despite the very high commitment of the IMO member states and the negotiations ongoing in London, that we cannot do the decarbonization, or we cannot make the decarbonization of shipping happening by ourselves. And that is kind of the message that we want to bring across here at COP, which we have done from the IMO Secretariat with the IMO Secretary General, and which I hope many of you here in the room are also doing. And we've had excellent discussions, many people, many panels, bilaterals with people in the energy sector, the finance sector, some of the other hard to abate sectors, but also with our partners within the UN system. And I'm grateful for our colleague from the International Energy Agency being on this panel. We have had discussions with IRENA, we have had discussions with the FAO to discuss exactly what you were mentioning. What are the opportunities in the decarbonization of shipping? And in order to really bank on those opportunities, be it in renewable energy production in the global south, be it in energy, the energy of shipping actually being a trigger for a wider energy transition in many other sectors. And we've spoken with ports about what they can do and how they can bring the different actors together. So maybe just to for these introductory words, to again express our gratitude, and that as a shipping community we should be very proud of ourselves that we have defined a net zero target. We've done that last year. We haven't sat still since defining that net zero target last year. Governments are now committed to putting in place the enabling framework of binding regulations, and that will include a pricing mechanism. You won't hear me saying that this will be a tax. The greenhouse gas strategy of the IMO refers to a pricing mechanism. There are various proposals on the table. including for a tax, including for a levy. What is key, though, is that, as usual, as per the IMO spirit that we often refer to in London, that we want to put in place a regulatory framework by consensus. And that means that in the coming year, we will work with the member states, with the industry, with civil society on defining a pricing mechanism for the shipping industry that is just and that will work for everyone and that will deliver something of benefit for everyone across the spectrum. Thank you.
Thank you a lot for this presentation of the work of the IMO and the discussions that are ongoing among member states and in the shipping sector. Let me move to the next speaker, Tom Evans, Senior Associate with the Global Solidarity Levies Task Force at the European Climate Foundation. So we've talked at several points in the previous presentation about this Global Solidarity Task Force. And so, Tom, can you detail a bit how this workforce is considering the shipping sector contribution to climate finance, and what are the opportunities in the implementation of a carbon tax, both in the shipping sector and other transportation modes?
Sure. Thank you, and thank you for having me, and thank you to Ferdi and T&E for organising today. And it's great to be part of the discussion, and it's great to hear the work of the task force coming up through our interventions so far. So very nice to have the opportunity to try and talk more about the work of the task force and to explain how we're approaching this challenge. So just to maybe set the scene and the context, the Global Solidarity Levies Task Force was created at COP28 last year. It was founded and is chaired by Barbados, France, and Kenya. And the inspiration for it really came out of a number of summits that took place in 2023, which were focused on the challenge of how do we close the financing gap for climate and development. We had in Paris the Financing Pact Summit, and then there was in Nairobi the Africa Climate Summit in that year. And these summits very much put forward many ideas across the whole landscape of climate finance, solutions and opportunities to close the financing gap. And that includes many issues far beyond the conversation we're having here today, such as reform of international financial architecture, tackling debt sustainability and fiscal space in developing countries, and of course, private sector. But one of the main solutions, one of the main ideas coming through time and again was solidarity levies, and of course, often referred to in these spaces as a form of innovative finance. But as all of you will know, solidarity levies being an idea which have been around for a long time in the climate space, and drawing on a long backstory and many years of parties and experts and researchers looking into how we could use such mechanisms to raise climate finance. And so really through that year at COP20 and culminating at COP28, the task force was born. So the challenge it's trying to address is very specific. It's not trying to raise climate finance for to solve the entire climate finance problem, but it's very focused on questions such as how do we provide adequate, predictable, concessional finance for developing countries, and how do we do that in a way which is fair? How do we do that in a way that reflects fairness and concerns of justice, so that the measures that we bring in don't have negative impacts and are fully thought through and addressed. And I think maybe the last part of the context is that the scale of the financial challenges is pretty significant. And if you look at the latest numbers, which have been published this week by experts like Nick Stern and Vera Somwe and Amar Bhattacharya and others, they talk of a $1 trillion financing gap in 2030 for developing countries outside of China, and a significant part of that they identify as coming from increased concessional finance, about 150 billion by 2030, which solidarity levies could play a part in addressing, and that's the motive. In terms of where we're at with the work of the task force, we are, over the past year, we've been growing in size, bringing countries on board, trying to engage in our work. We now have 17 countries who are members of what we're calling the Coalition for Solidarity Levies, and we've been doing outreach and engagement with further countries to bring them on board too. We've also been looking at the options. What are the technical options on the table? And I just want to pause on that very briefly. We have, of course, the maritime shipping levy is one of those options, but the others include an international aviation levy. That could be a levy on kerosene fuel or related to carbon pricing. It could also be a ticket levy, which would be focused on the selling of air tickets. There's the fossil fuel extraction or fossil fuel levy, including a fossil fuel extraction levy or a excess profits levy. The latter may be particularly relevant in the wake of the spike in gas prices since 2022 and a lot of conversation in many economies around windfall profits. So picking up on that political energy. Financial transaction taxes are also an option under consideration. These have been described and discussed for many years, and could be a significant source of revenue for climate and development finance. And the last in our mandate is carbon pricing, which is somewhat cross-cutting across many of those, but of course highly relevant. And so those were the main options that we're looking at. And you can, if you want more information on those, we recently published our progress report yesterday. It's available on our website, and that sets out where we're at in terms of our thinking around these options. Just to again maybe take some time to talk about what's next for our work before diving into the shipping. The work of the task force over the next year will be focused on developing and identifying concrete proposals for solidarity levies based on extensive existing research and analysis in this space. We're not writing these from scratch. We have a lot of experts and existing work, but trying to bring countries around in dialogue about different proposals and then working towards building coalitions of the willing and champion countries who are willing to take these proposals and put them forward for implementation. And at COP30 is the deadline. It's when our task force will come to an end. And by then we hope to have built political momentum around the various options. In terms of the shipping agenda, it's one which the task force is approaching with full appreciation of the context we're in, where we have the IMO negotiations in full swing. And there has been a lot of discussion around the fact that we don't want to come in and try and duplicate that or replicate that, but really seeing that as an important process, an important moment next year, where we could very well see an outcome on a measure at the IMO. But importantly, for the Solidarity Levies Task Force and the coalition of countries supporting it, or many of the countries supporting it, it will be important to see an outcome that has a component related to raising climate finance for developing countries, and we will be looking at how we can support politically. And the coalition is a political initiative as much as it is a technical process of examining proposals. It is a political coalition looking at trying to lead to advocate for outcomes which would be in keeping with our aims. So that's the idea in terms of how we would want to see something at the IMO. I'm not one of the countries, so I might refrain from trying to judge how we might do that. And I think we're very much in a process of thinking through over the next months. Can we at a political level provide direction and leadership that would be conducive to such an outcome at the IMO? While I can't say anything right now, I think that's something that we're discussing and would hope to say more on in due course. Maybe I'll leave it there so we have time for questions and a good discussion. But thank you again for the floor and look forward to the discussion.
Thank you a lot, Tom Evans. And before we move to question and answer with the audience, maybe I will just ask an additional question to Ms. Pratt and about how, from the members' country perspectives, do you think policymakers can make the shipping industry contribute to climate finance?
Well, thank you very much, Vene, for giving me this opportunity to take the floor again. And as I mentioned earlier, the OACPS is a 79-member strong organisation of developing vulnerable countries from the Global South. And so the former speakers have all, referenced a range of initiatives and public policy, global policy processes that are underway. And I'd like to perhaps highlight here some initiatives in those multilateral processes of some of our member states and their leadership on this. The High Ambition Coalition, which was set up at COP21 by the Republic of the Marshall Islands, and that almost 10 years ago. And they continue, of course, to show leadership on this. And in fact, at the COP26, joined with a range of High Ambition Coalition leaders in a statement. And there's a particular part of that statement that I found quite potent and pertinent for today, and that is resolve to support ambitious policies to reduce emissions in transport sectors, including to take more ambitious climate action in shipping and aviation. And I think that since then we've seen some considerable progress. Progress such as the Pacific Six Pack, co-chaired by Fiji and the Marshall Islands, and also bringing together other African, Caribbean and Pacific SIDS into the IMO negotiations. And I think that, again, their efforts in those negotiations must be considered in a very positive way. Again, given some of the comments made about, the fact that the climate emergency is impacting many developing countries, especially SIDS and LDCs. And noting, I'm quite attracted to this metric where we hear that shipping contributes at least 3% to global GHG emissions, and our 79 countries, making up 1.3 billion people, collectively contribute 2% of global greenhouse gas emissions. And I think that we should remain quite mindful of this as we start to think about what a global tax and levy framework might look like, and who should actually be receiving and how they should be receiving revenue. So, what does that revenue disbursement mechanism look like? Who should be actually receiving the most of it and how? We talk about concessional or access to quality and concessional finance. And I think, again, we should be trying to set some metrics, for example, at least, or no more, sorry, not at least, no more than 1% of interest annually, and, 1.5%, no more than 1.5% of administrative fees on committed funds. I think these sorts of things, are aspects that should be key considerations in any of these negotiations. And the IMO and the shipping sector, important, the aviation sector, important. And so I was very interested, to hear the presentation just made on the Global Solidarity Levies Task Force, and would join with the task force, given that, of course, Barbados and Kenya are members of the OACPS. But I think we need to start to think about how an organisation like the OACPS can work usefully with such task forces, how we can, for example, be a convening mechanism for our 79 member countries before they move into these IMO negotiations. These sorts of things would I think offer a much more informed and considered global public policy on a matter that is of extreme importance for our countries. Thank you very much.
Thank you a lot for this these additional elements, and maybe just to wrap up a bit what has been said in this panel. So I think what we all insist on is that the ambition is a global scheme, but at the same time, as a starting point, regional agreements can have important effects towards the goal of decarbonizing the shipping sector, and also a global shipping tax would be one element towards a global carbon tax, a global carbon price, sorry, as we also has been mentioned several times, a global carbon price that includes both shipping, of course, but also other modes of transport, other energies, and so on. So also the revenues from the global shipping tax can be substantial, and of course, vulnerable countries that would be impacted quite importantly by the different schemes, the different tax schemes, should be compensated with the returns from the tax. There are promising discussions at the International Maritime Organization, and that aim towards a global regulatory framework for the shipping sector, so including, of course, potential pricing mechanisms, but not only, also standards and other measures, and also the reflection. There is a global thinking in the task force for the Global Solidarities Levies task force that include both the shipping sector but also other sectors. So maybe we have some time for questions from the audience. So if you have one, you may raise your hand, and maybe there is a mic to begin. Okay, just wait for the microphone.
Thank you for such an enlightening panel, Emma Fenton from Opportunity Green. I was fascinated by the issue raised in your opening remarks about the notion that a shipping tax could inadvertently push freight into other sectors, such as aviation, which would have disastrous unintended consequences, not least for emissions. How can we, as a global community, try and push for a similar level of ambition at ICAO, a UN institution that is historically and notoriously lacking in ambition?
Just a few words, and then I will let also my colleagues complete the first statement. So I think the point with the substitution across sector is that the aviation sector is so much carbon intensive compared to the maritime sector that there is no need to be a huge substitution between sectors to moderate or at least reduce a lot the effects of decarbonization in the maritime sector. So ideally, there should be a carbon price, a positive carbon price, both on the maritime sectors and on the aviation freight sector. But what is difficult is that this type of schemes are discussed in different fora. So we can think about these schemes in, for instance, I think in the Global Solidarity Levy Task Force, there is the wish to envision both type of carbon prices, but the difficulty in the implementation is then that, for instance, the IMO will not discuss aviation tax, will discuss only maritime tax. So maybe if you wish to complement, yes.
I'd like to try and answer that in a really simplistic way. We've been successful in the IMO. The member states of the IMO are member states of ICAO, a multilateral organization. And so, I do wonder whether, similar advocacy and approaches can be taken, in these various multilateral settings. I mean, it's not, it is impacting all of us, and climate change is cross-sectoral. It has impacts across all sectors. And so again, I offer that we've got to be very pointed in how we consider our diplomacy, advocacy approaches in really shaping global public polity on this. Thank you.
Yeah, I think building on that, it feels like maybe the challenge is that there is a disconnect between and within many governments when it comes to these different sectors and these different issues. And it would strike me that one of the things that at least we're trying to do through the task force, being a leaders level initiative, and countries started it at leaders level, and we look to kind of the highest political level to be able to move forward, is because that's where the mandate for a country's trajectory comes from. And it's often, I think it's not only just because of this issue of like kind of different sectors, but also because finance ministries and climate ministries are often or can be in tension with each other when it comes to questions of how to fund the transition or how to raise revenues. And that's why I think the escalation of the political agenda is so important, raising it above any one particular silo, but really centering it. It's why the integration of the IMO and ICAO and COP and other spaces and having these conversations, as you were saying, in a cross-cutting way is so important. I don't think that's necessarily straightforward, but the task force certainly wants to be able to be a place where we could maybe do that.
Let me be clear. I don't want to comment on ICAOs because I'm obviously not in a position to do that. But what I do want to say, and I said it at the beginning, is that COP is a good platform to come together and to learn from the experience in different sectors. And we actually share with ICAO an agenda item on the Substar. So we're not only participating in side events, which are very important, but the IMO as well as ICAO, we also report our progress in our work on decarbonization of our respective sectors to Substar. And we've had discussions earlier this week on their agenda item 14B, which is on bunker fuels. And I think it's important that we bring our respective experiences, state of play, to the COP community, and to, in that way, kind of cross-change experiences, what can work, what cannot work, but also what is needed in order to get the energy sector on board, what is needed to get the financial sector on board in order to create better market conditions. And you mentioned in the beginning the need for concessional loans in order to get some of the energy infrastructure going. So I think that is what I can say from my perspective, that what can work in a certain industry may not work in another, but COP provides a very important platform to learn from each other.
Thank you. Is there another question? Yes.
Yes, thank you for a very informative panel. I had a very a specific question for Christelle, as the ASG of OACPS. I guess given that, you know, in the context of multiple countries, sometimes with different perspectives participating in discussions in the IMO, do you see a role for the OACPS or for other secretariats that manage the relationships between countries from different regions? Thank you.
Well, thank you very much. And I did sort of make a lateral reference to this earlier in my response to a question but from VNA. I don't think that the OACPS has realised its full potential in terms of its role as a convener in this important issue of shipping. And I, in fact, have had some discussions, and I would like to be able to see how we, the OACPS, can provide that opportunity for our member states to convene in advance of, you know, important negotiations that take place in wider multilateral settings, such as, you know, the IMO and other settings. We prepare ourselves here for COP29, and so there's a preparatory process. But on these very specific, important sector processes as well, and I would offer that we need to really explore rather quickly how we, as the OACPS, can provide that opportunity for our members to convene in a place where they can determine what it is that they would like to pursue in terms of prosecuting important policy decisions at the global level. Thank you.
That's another question, yes?
Good afternoon, and thank you to the panel for your presentation. My question may be a bit premature because I understand that the mechanisms are still being discussed. But maybe if you can give us an idea, like, for example, how the taxes will be collected, how it will be managed, how it will be distributed. Any idea? At this point, if you can just give us an idea.
Roll, I think it's for you.
Yes, happy to do that. Under the big caveat that, as you said, this is under negotiation, and I'm under the close watch of a couple of member states here in this panel. So I don't want to make any faux pas in kind of prejudging any of the discussions. But it's a very good question, a very important one, on which we've had already quite extensive discussions in the IMO and which are still ongoing in view of coming to a consensus in the next year. What I think is important in terms of the collection component is that we have in the IMO an important treaty and convention, an environmental convention, MARPO, already in place, which provides or sets binding standards on ships, individual ships. And so it's likely that, or actually where we are now is that we have already draft regulatory text, draft amendments to that main convention, MARPO Annex 6, on the table. And for the moment, the draft regulations put obligations on the individual ships, obligations that build on the existing energy efficiency framework of the IMO, as well as on existing fuel consumption reporting requirements. So basically, the regulatory framework on the development, both a fuel standard, a carbon content reduction requirement, as well as a pricing mechanism, is very likely to be linked to the main object of our regulations, which is the ship. Many member states have indicated a preference for the IMO to play a key role in both the collection as well as the oversight and kind of determining how the revenue collected should be spent. And I explicitly say oversight, meaning that it is for the IMO member states to decide on how revenue should be spent and how the different areas or the different activities that would be eligible for receiving revenue should be defined. And I think that's quite an important component. That doesn't mean that there may be other organizations involved in one way or another in that disbursement. But I think it's quite, or the course of direction of the discussions in the IMO is that there's a preference of many of our member states that the IMO itself should control or have a say, should determine on how the revenue is being spent. And that may be very diverse. It may be to provide a reward to the ship owners that will use low carbon fuel alternatives. It may be to support some kind of financial mechanism that should reduce risks, guarantees, systems. It will also likely to be used for many other purposes that will help the transition of shipping. And that can be very, very diverse, ranging from support to domestic fleet renewal, to support to port adaptation in countries, particularly those that are subject to climate change impacts and the operations of their ports. It may be to seafarer training, the human element. It may be to increase renewable fuel production for the shipping industry. So the interest of countries in shipping is very diverse. But what is clear is that every country in the IMO has an interest in shipping because it's their lifeline to global trade. So let me stop there. I think this is as much I can say at this point in time, but coming back to some of the previous discussions that were held, it is clear that our membership is committed to create a revenue-raising component under the next set of binding regulations that we're developing. So that, I think, is a very important step forward in decarbonizing the shipping industry.
Thank you. I think we have 1 minute left, so I will just say a few concluding words and let my colleague also add if they wish. And on this point on what should be done with the proceeds from the tax and how it should be distributed, we need to remember that all citizens in countries would be impacted by price increases. So that's important that they also benefit from the proceeds and not just governments, because the price increase will be will have impact on all citizens in the different countries. So I'm going to stop here, and if Ms. Pratt, if you wish to add concluding words, or Mr. Evans.
Just a few words that I want us to always keep front of mind, and that is common but differentiated responsibilities. I really do feel that we need to be very mindful of those countries, vulnerable developing countries that are at the front line of climate change. And of course, these sorts of instruments, these innovative instruments, will provide some levels of relief, but at the end of it, we don't want to double burden and triple burden these countries. And so we've got to, as we build these new systems, be really mindful of the fact that there are some countries that have not caused this problem, but that are suffering the brunt and the heaviest of burdens. And so I just wanted to leave it there. And I know that it's not exactly about the shipping, the global shipping tax and levy, but it is something that we need to be mindful of as we build these new systems going forward. Thank you.
So I think we have to stop here. So thank you all the panelists and the audience for the interesting discussion and all the interesting comments also. Thank you all. Bye.